So now our topic of the energy debate. For those of you that have been here in past years, you may recall that I've hosted a panel around energy policy, and I've tried very hard to have all points of views represented, to engender a lively discussion. But what I've found, and I suppose it's human nature, is people are just simply too polite. Behind closed doors, they might say, oh, that guy's got it absolutely wrong. But then you somehow get them on a panel in front of 700 people, and they start to say nice things like, you have a very good point, but, which is all fine and good, that's human nature, but it's not nearly as entertaining as having a real debate. So you may be wondering why we've got other podiums up here. That's because we're going to do a slight shift in our presentational format this year and have a structured debate. It's going to be a lot of fun. So with that, why don't I call up my two debaters, and we'll do an introduction of the two of them. We heard a little bit about them already. Robert there, Tyson there. Excellent. Okay, so first, to my right is Robert Bryce. Robert is a journalist, an author, managing editor at the Energy Tribune. He's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Can't do much justice in the time that we have to your long and distinguished biography, but you've published in the Atlantic Monthly, Slate, New York Times, Washington Post, The Guardian, The Nation, American Conservative. You have a number of books, including The Gusher of Lies, The Dangerous Delusions of Energy Independence, and this wonderful thing that I'm working through right now, Power Hungry, The Myths of Green Energy and the Real Fuels of the Future. Doesn't leave us much question as to which side of the debate you're going to take, Robert, so thank you very much. To my left is Tyson Slocum. You may have seen Tyson here in previous years. Tyson is the director of Public Citizens Energy Program. Tyson has been with Public Citizens since 2000, and he's their energy director promoting decentralized, sustainable energy, providing affordable, clean energy solutions for working families. He covers the regulation of electricity, natural gas and petroleum markets, commodities, futures, FERC jurisdictional matters, and other things. He's also on the CFTC's Energy and Environmental Markets Advisory Committee. You also, if you watch the Fox Business Channel, or you've watched the Colbert Report, or you've watched the O'Reilly Factor, you may have seen Tyson there. And importantly, today's Houston Chronicle front page. Tyson, you timed it perfectly. I'm sure it was a coincidence, right? So, of course. Thank you for joining us. Excellent. Okay. Now, let me just set the ground rules here briefly as to how we're going to run this debate. What we'll do is we'll start with opening statements for both of you to sort of orientate yourselves for 3 minutes in the world of energy policy. I think we have an idea where you're going to go. And then we'll go into questions. I'll start with you, Robert, ask you a question. You'll provide us the answer. And then, Tyson, you'll get a chance to rebut, if you will, for 2 minutes. So 3 minutes and 2 minutes. And then we'll alternate 3 minutes and 2 minutes back and forth. I've got a number of questions that will cover sort of the whole gamut of energy policy. But to just liven things up a little bit, each debater has 3 of these. This gives them the opportunity at any time to hold one up and demand a minute to refute what somebody else is saying. If you just simply can't let that hang out there, you can hold it up and say, hold on, I need a minute. So we're going to have a lot of fun. It'll be interesting strategy. I feel like we've got a reality show in the works here with these things. So it's going to be a lot of fun. Right. So with that, we're going to start with 3 minutes opening statement from each of our participants today to sort of provide orientation on their point of view. Robert, we'll begin with you. Thank you.
Okay. Morning. So if you look at your program, the statement about this session is called Green versus Brown, the ongoing debate about the future of U.S. energy policy. So unfortunately, this debate has been couched in this binary green versus brown comparison. Good versus bad. Green, the color of lettuce and trees and Shrek and Kermit. And brown is the color of, well... So we have green versus brown when we have the president talking about clean energy versus yesterday's energy. Now, just by a show of hands, who here is in favor of dirty energy? Not very many. The reality is that hydrocarbons are here to stay. And that is the reason is because they can provide us with the reliable, dispatchable power that we demand at prices we can afford in the quantities that the global economy requires. In Power Hungry, thank you, John, for holding it up. By the way, it's in paperback now. You don't have to read it. You just have to buy it. But in the book, I make the point about what I call the four imperatives: power density, energy density, cost, and scale. And hydrocarbons can meet all of the four imperatives. Renewables, unfortunately, for all of their merits, I live in Austin, I have 3,200 watts of solar panels on the roof of my house. Renewable energy from the sun and the wind, unfortunately, cannot meet the four imperatives. I'm skeptical of solar and wind because they cost too much. I'm skeptical of green energy because it cannot provide the scale of energy that we require. The political darlings of the moment, what are they? Solar, wind, biomass, geothermal are providing 277,000 barrels of oil equivalent to the U.S. economy per day. Coal, oil, and natural gas, 40 million barrels of oil equivalent per day. Hydrocarbons are providing 140 times as much primary energy to the U.S. economy as all of the political darlings of the moment, and yet that's all we hear about. And they're getting massive subsidies. So what we should be talking about, in fact, is not green versus brown. It should be fantasy versus reality. With all due respect to Ivo de Boer, the reality is that energy transitions happen over decades or even centuries. And the idea that we're going to make some sudden pivot and move to solar something, wind something, unobtainium something is simply wrong. I'm in favor of air conditioning and cold beer. Call it green energy, brown energy, striped, paisley, I don't care. But our focus on our energy discussion should be cheap, abundant, reliable. Cheap, abundant, reliable, and if possible, domestic. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Tyson.
Robert, that was an interesting overview of an advocacy for the status quo, and the status quo that is going to be bankrupting this great country of ours. This is a debate between the fax machine and the iPod. The fact is that, or the iPad, the fact is that the United States has to transform its energy system with existing technologies. The types of energy density advantages of the energy choices that Robert is advocating are paling in comparison to the advantages that technology, investments in the microgrid, and renewable energy, distributed renewable energy, can bring the kind of transformative changes to the power sector and the transportation sector that this country must invest in if we are going to remain competitive. Robert talked about the affordability of today's brown energy system. I don't know if you've checked the price of gas or oil, but it is not affordable, and it is never going to come back down price-wise. And the fact is that the United States can never produce its way to lower oil prices, and that the recent explosion in natural gas and the dampening of natural gas prices is based on an incredibly risky proposition of a technology that, while I am sure there are many oil and gas professionals in this room that are dedicated to excellent service, the fact is that there are going to be mistakes made. And those mistakes are going to involve our water, and we cannot risk making the huge investments that threaten those kinds of natural resources. The fact is that our energy systems, as Vice President Dick Cheney laid out yesterday, we've spent a century laying down $1 trillion infrastructure here in the United States, and he says that that is okay, that we need to continue feeding that pipeline. And the fact is that we're seeing right now families and businesses are starting to exit the grid. They're no longer relying on their local utility. They are self-generating. The more people that leave the grid, the more the costs are going to rise for everyone else, and the more incentives we're going to see. We're seeing solar be cost competitive with other forms of generation. And the fact is that when we decentralize the grid and move towards localized sources of energy and focus on a transportation policy that prioritizes the electrification of the transportation sector along with mass transit, we can start to see the kind of transformation that this country absolutely must make if we're going to remain competitive. And I haven't even discussed the role that climate change plays in our continuing fossil fuel addiction. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, very good. Those are our opening statements. Oh, yeah, that didn't take long. Robert, you have 1 minute to provide. I'll take that from you.
I don't know where to start. Affordability? Tyson, natural gas is at I think it closed yesterday at $4.36. Between 2005 and 2008, natural gas prices averaged over $7. They're now $4. The $3 drop in price per MMBTU is saving the U.S. economy $65 billion a year. It's $180 million a day. Affordability? You said prices are never going to come back down? They already have. Do you read the paper? Risky technology. You know, we hear this over and over, but energy density. You mentioned energy density. I've written a book. I talk great length. What do you mean by energy density? I'll let you respond when you can. Localized sources of energy. Are you suggesting all of us drill a well in our backyards? The scale of energy consumption is so large that the idea, yes, localized sources of energy, I have it. I have solar panels on the roof of my house. But I can't be independent of the grid, nor do I want to be. Solar cost competitive with the grid power. Grid power is 10 cents a kilowatt hour. EIA's latest number is PV is 50 cents. Okay, I've finished my minute.
All right. I feel like we're going to be out of X's before we get to our first question. Okay, Tyson, please.
Robert, the fact is that just looking at the market price of a fossil fuel commodity does not reflect its cost to society. When you look at the massive amounts of water that hydraulic fracturing has to use, is that factored in the market price? When you look at what the risks are to North American water systems, the millions and millions of gallons that are required per well, the risks to our aquifers, to our clean drinking water, how is that priced? The fact is that there are massive embedded subsidies that the fossil fuel industry enjoys every day courtesy of the American taxpayer. Our Pentagon budget this year is $712 billion. How much of our taxpayer dollars go to defend the kinds of actions that the Vice President, Dick Cheney, was talking about yesterday to make sure that, that foreign sources of oil can arrive to the United States safely? That's a huge embedded advantage. The fact is that demand growth is now structurally at about 0.6% for electricity in the United States. And if you look at the long-term competitive advantage of generating your own energy through rooftop solar, micro wind turbines, and through energy efficiency, there's a revolution going on in this country right now of companies that are bringing energy efficiency solutions to the commercial and industrial space, and next up is households. There are huge advantages to energy efficiency.
Okay, would you like
and
to
I'm
give
over
us
time.
another X? Right. I wanted to stop in, when you finished the sentence, but it just kept rolling, Tyson. It's quite fast. I think our concern about these gentlemen being too polite, we don't have to worry about this. This is going to be a lot of fun. Okay. Let's ask our first question. So 3 minutes followed by 2 minutes. Robert, we've just heard Eva de Boer give us the state of global efforts around creating a climate change framework and the issues and the imperatives there. Given the state of economies in the United States, in Europe, many other countries around the world, is this really the best allocation of governmental activity, the amount of energy that governments are expending around this discussion of climate change? Are there more important issues that they should be working on, or is this an imperative?
Well, I thought Eva de Boer's presentation was fascinating. What are you talking about? Energy policy, energy security, material scarcity, and population growth. Look, there are a lot of reasons to be pessimistic going forward, but I'm an optimist. And maybe that's because I have young kids, but when I look forward, I look at all the innovations happening in the oil and gas industry that are driving prices down, that are happening regardless of mandates and subsidies. But to Mr. de Boer's points, in my view, this idea that we're going to have global carbon taxes or global carbon limits, I think is simply not going to happen. With all due respect to him, I think Kyoto failed, Copenhagen failed, Cancun failed. I don't know where the meeting will be this year, but it's going to fail. Why? Because the developing countries of the world understand that to bring their people out of poverty, they have to use hydrocarbons. And they're going to use hydrocarbons for all the reasons I stated before. Power density, energy density, cost, and scale. These are the most available, dispatchable sources of energy and power that we have. Now, everywhere, always, economic growth is directly correlated with energy consumption. Always, everywhere, particularly electricity. And the U.S. has made the claim that President Obama has said that the U.S. will reduce its CO2 emissions by 80% by 2050. I'm sorry, I'm extraordinarily skeptical that that target will be hit. To achieve that would mean that the U.S. will have per capita CO2 emissions on par with present-day industrial powerhouses such as North Korea, Cuba, and Syria. My view on climate change is resolute agnosticism. I understand the arguments for it. I understand the arguments, the skeptics. I understand the catastrophists. The reality is, I don't know. And my answer is, okay, well, what's the solution? My answer is natural gas to nuclear. We have to be using more natural gas for the carbon advantages. We have to be using nuclear for the same reasons. We have to get good at nuclear, even in the wake of Fukushima. And I understand the dimensions of the problems there. But we cannot ignore the fact that you have now, today, 1.5 billion people around the world living without electricity. 400 million people in India alone. Over the next 15 years, 350 million Chinese will move into cities that haven't been built yet. Mr. DeBoer mentioned the IPCC. Before the meeting in Copenhagen, Rajendra Pachauri said, we have 400 million people living without electricity. By the way, we're going to be burning a lot of coal. The head of the IPCC said this. Energy transitions happen over decades or even centuries. But I'm optimistic. Why? Because we're decarbonizing. Globally, the decarbonization trend has been underway for 2 centuries. It's going to continue, and in fact, it's accelerating. We're increasing in energy efficiency. The U.S. is using about the same amount of oil today as it did in the early 1970s, even though we're driving twice as many miles. We are moving toward end-to-end, natural gas to nuclear, and I think that's positive. I'm also very bullish on solar. But we can talk about that later. I'm quitting on time.
Thank you. All right, Tyson, 2 minutes.
First, I think it's really important for leaders in the oil and gas industry to stand up and to say that climate change science is real, that the United States has an obligation to lead on this issue, because there is too much nonsense going on in Washington, D.C. with recently elected leaders who deny the science behind climate change. We can have a robust debate about what the best approaches are to deal with it, but the fact that we still have leaders in the United States Congress that are denying the underlying science behind climate change is an outrage. And we need to have leaders in the fossil fuel industry stand up to that nonsense and start addressing that head on. Second, Public Citizen took a leadership role in working with Republicans and Democrats on the only bipartisan climate bill in the United States Senate last year. We worked with Senator Maria Cantwell, a Democrat from Washington State, and Republican Susan Collins of Maine, in the CLEAR Act. And that essentially functions like a carbon tax, with the government collecting the revenues and immediately kicking back 75% of the proceeds of that carbon tax back to families on a per capita basis to offset the increases in energy and other costs, with the remaining 25% of that fund for deployment of renewable energy initiatives and R&D. That's the kind of leadership that we need. I was disappointed that the Presidential Commission on the Deficit did not include a carbon tax in its proposal, because we are in an era of constrained federal spending, and we're going to need to start to catch up to our competitors like China and others, and we have to start generating new sources of federal revenue. And I think the bipartisan plan that Public Citizen has worked on is the fairest start to do that.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, our next question. Tyson, 3 minutes for you. With cap-and-trade legislation in the United States seemingly, perhaps not dead, but at least in a persistent vegetative state, let's call it, do you think the EPA should push harder to regulate greenhouse gas emissions as an administrative matter rather than through legislation?
Well, I think everyone can agree, the President included, that the EPA is not the ideal entity to regulate greenhouse gases. Regulating it under the Clean Air Act is a little clunky. Now, there's some in Congress who say that Barack Obama is running an out-of-control EPA, and that is just false. That's just politics. The fact is that the United States Supreme Court in 2007 said the EPA must regulate greenhouse gas emissions under its existing authority under the Clean Air Act. And the Bush administration began that process of implementing those rules, and they were continued under the Obama administration. The Obama administration was working with Congress to try to come up with an alternative, and that was replacing the EPA regulation of greenhouse gas emissions with a market-based regulatory framework of cap and trade. Now, I had a lot of problems with the Waxman-Markey bill, but central to that legislation was the evisceration of EPA authority under the Clean Air Act. It was a trade, and you had a lot of businesses sign on, and I think that we need to continue those efforts. The fact is that until we have a system in place that regulates greenhouse gas emissions, large industries are going to be paralyzed on making the kinds of investments we need, particularly in the utility sector. This is something that I think we need to see a lot more responsibility in terms of corporate America in getting behind the science of climate change and communicating very clearly to members of Congress and to presidential candidates that it is no longer acceptable to say that we don't need to do anything about climate change. The rest of the world is acting on it, and we are falling behind. We're falling behind in the technology race. That has been America's bread and butter. That is where we have always led, and the Chinese are eclipsing us because they are dedicating money where we are not. And this is a travesty. We need to catch up because the future is not in fossil fuels. The future is in the microgrid, it is in emerging technologies, it's in renewables. Those are the fuels of the future. Over the next century, the countries that are investing today are the ones that are going to be winning the global competitiveness debate. To continue this talk that we've got $1 trillion of sunk capital to serve our oil and gas needs and we don't have to change anything because it's all pipelined in there is a recipe for disaster. The price of oil is never going to go back to $30 a barrel. We are in an era of permanently higher prices, and that has devastating impacts on the ability of our economy to respond and compete globally.
Robert, 2-minute response.
Sure. Well, okay, the Chinese are eclipsing us. The Chinese would give their eye teeth. They give us all the tea in China to live like we do. Eclipsing us? They're building a coal plant a week. They're planning on building 60 nuclear plants in China. They're using a fraction. We're so much more productive than the Chinese. I can't even begin here. But anyway, sorry. The story in terms of CO2 emissions is not about the US. It's in the developing world. It's India, China, Malaysia, Vietnam, Laos, you name it. So this idea that the EPA is now going to be empowered to regulate greenhouse gases, I think, is absurd. It's going to be challenged in Congress. It's going to be challenged again in the courts. The administration is trying to do bureaucratically what it could not do legislatively. And I think that's fundamentally wrong. On a policy that's this important, that's hit this wide of an impact on the economy, this is a legislative issue, not a bureaucratic issue. And to say, oh, we're going to turn it over to an unelected bureaucracy and say, you decide, that's anti-democratic. It's the wrong way to go, fundamentally, as just a constitutional matter. The Clean Air Act does not cover carbon dioxide, and to include it as a pollutant is just pure foolishness. I looked up the language on the EPA's website last night. It says that the EPA, under the Clean Air Act, sets limits on certain pollutants, including setting limits on how much can be in the air anywhere in the United States. So everyone in this room, including me, particularly me, we're polluting, we're breathing. CO2 is a pollutant. So now the EPA is going to come and talk to me, I'm breathing too much? It's madness. It's pure foolishness, and I think that this idea that the politicization of science, this was the charge against the Bush administration, continually, they're politicizing science. The EPA just approved this move to E15 as a gift to the corn ethanol scammers, and in their own documents they say it will make air quality worse. This is the worst kind of politicization of what is supposed to be a scientific agency.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I'm getting all worked up here. I'm going to calm down.
Right. Okay, let's get a little more granular now. Let's move into some additional questions. We're going to sort of do a tour through for everything from fossil fuels, renewables, shale gas. But let's start, Robert, with a question for you. Seems that at one point there were some people holding out hope we would get some form of comprehensive energy legislation here in the U.S. this year. Seems that is dimming. The prospects of that are dimming. So it seems that the spotlight on energy policy, at least here in the U.S., is now going to shine on the states.
Sure.
Depending on how you count it, something like 29 states now have renewable portfolio standards. These are mandates that a certain percentage of the power come from renewable energy. What do you believe the long-term outcome of these mandates will be? Is it going to be, I think as many of those states hope, a great leap forward in capturing the new green economy? or are those states simply going to make themselves anti-competitive relative to the non-renewable portfolio states? 3 minutes.
Sure, thanks. Well, last month I spoke at an energy conference at Tufts University, and the keynote speaker there was Sudeen Kelly. She just retired from the FERC. She spent 6 years on the FERC. She was appointed by Bush. She's from Albuquerque, I believe. But during her speech, she said something that once she said it, I thought, oh, this is stunningly obvious. I don't know why I didn't think of this or didn't understand it. She said this: a renewable portfolio standard is a back-end way to put a price on carbon. So now we have these more than 28, 29 states who have, in fact, put a back-end price on carbon. Now, how many of those states and those voters in those states would have approved this policy had they known that, in fact, it was a carbon tax? They would have all failed. Well, California maybe, Oregon, a few other states perhaps. But I would guarantee you that the vast majority of these states would not have these renewable portfolio standards. Further, what I think is happening now, and we're beginning to see the backlash against these renewable portfolio standards because of cost. The latest data from the EIA shows that over the next 5 years or so, natural gas-fired electricity will cost about $63 per megawatt hour. Wind-generated electricity will cost 50% more. Again, EIA data. Offshore wind, not that it's going to happen in the U.S., but offshore wind will produce electricity costing 4 times as much, and solar thermal electricity 5 times as much. In January, the LA Times reported that the city's goal, LADWP's goal of having 33% of their electricity coming from renewables by 2020 would, quote, I'm quoting, result in electric rate hikes of 5 to 8% in each of the next 5 years. That's anti-consumer. And now the LADWP, before Governor Brown signed this new bill requiring 33% renewable electricity statewide by 2030, LADWP was already rolling back its targets because of cost. In Colorado, electric rates have increased 21% over the past 6 years, twice the rate of inflation. Colorado was the first state to pass a renewable portfolio standard statewide. And according to the Denver Post, rates are likely to increase another 20%. Why? Largely because of the renewable energy mandates and the cost of the transmission lines to bring distant renewables into the urban areas. In March, the Cascade Policy Institute estimated that the renewable energy mandates in Oregon will increase the cost of electricity in that state by 24% by 2025. These mandates are leading to higher electric rates across the board. It's anti-consumer. And I hold up a red card, but I still have 20 seconds left. Tyson, I just find your positions on this to be fundamentally in conflict. You say you're a consumer advocate, but the positions you're advocating are opposed to the working poor and the middle class. 44 million Americans are now on food stamps. Since 2008, the number of Americans on food stamps has gone up by 40%. 14% of U.S. Citizens are now on food stamps, teetering on the edge of hunger, and now we're going to raise electric rates. I think it's bad policy.
Tyson, 2 minutes.
What I just heard was really bad analysis of EIA data. It is absolutely false to suggest that a variable such as a state RPS is the determining factor of electric rates for all generation sources that make up the fuel mix in a given state. The fact is that, to give a statistic, like Colorado was the first one to pass an RPS, a renewable portfolio standard, and in the last 6 years, its rates have gone up 20-something%. That isn't accounting for the fact that natural gas prices had been more expensive, and it's a gas-fired state, and therefore the utilities had asked for a collection of those higher rates, and that was the largest driver of electric rate increases. So to say that there's a correlation between states with an RPS and higher rates is false. And many of the states that have made initiatives on renewable mandates had done so because they were already operating at a high rate level because of legacy costs of nuclear power and deregulation and things like that. The fact is that those states that are pioneering the clean energy investments are moving ahead, and they are providing their businesses and households with more opportunities to not have the utility make their energy decisions for them. Robert is outlining the Stalinist, statist view of energy policy, where commercial and industrial and household consumers will just take whatever energy choices utilities and public utility commissions make for us, whereas I want to democratize the grid. and move towards the cost-effective solutions long-term that are going to revolutionize the way that we produce and use energy in the United States. The fact is that there were some of those renewable portfolio standards that were ballot approved, where it came before the voters. And when you look in electric choice states like Texas and others, people are actually willing to pay a little more for wind power because they like the clean energy that they get in return.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Oh, there we go. 1 minute for Robert, please.
I just have to point out, Tyson, you didn't give us a single number, not a single example, not a single state, not a single rate case, not a single cost per kilowatt hour. Moving ahead, not having energy decisions made for them. Stalinist. Somehow I'm a, I'm a socialist. That one makes my head hurt. Democratizing the grid. How does a man who's making minimum wage or something close to it install his own power generation equipment? How do they possibly, oh, well, he's going to get a Honda generator. What does that cost per kilowatt hour? I don't know, 50, 60, 70 cents a kilowatt hour? You know, I'm hearing your arguments, but I'm not hearing anything behind them. Not a single number, not a single citation, you say EIA doesn't, you can't believe EIA. Well, okay, well then come back at me with something that approaches a reference to any kind of expert or a reliable source other than Public Citizen. Not that Public Citizen is I would doubt the credibility of what comes from Public Citizen.
Thank you.
Per Robert's request. The city of Gainesville, Florida, public utility town, they have something called a feed-in tariff down there. It's something that some other countries have. Germany, for example, has a national feed-in tariff. That's why they've got 450% more installed solar capacity than the United States does. And that's why they are a manufacturing export nation of solar photovoltaic systems, because they created a domestic market first and now are exporting. And if you were trying to buy solar photovoltaics, you're either going to be buying them from a German company or a Chinese company, not an American company. You want facts? The fact is that this city of Gainesville, Florida, with its feed-in tariff, we worked with low-income advocates there so that the rate of increase cannot exceed 1% in rates. And as a result now, Gainesville has more installed solar capacity than the rest of the state of Florida combined. When you put in aggressive initiatives to give consumers, in Gainesville it's commercial and household, you give them the options to make investments in solar energy, they're going to do it. And the fact is that you've got investors that can go in through the feed-in tariff and approach a house and say, listen, we want to install solar panels that we'll own, they'll be on your house, no charge to you. That's the kind of future that Public Citizen likes.
Thank you. Well, that really tees up the next question perfectly, that little discussion, that little exchange there. So, Tyson, 3 minutes for you. Since we're on the topic of renewable energy now, you are aware that renewable energy technologies rely heavily on subsidies. Those are tax subsidies in the United States. They're feed-in tariffs, as you alluded to, in Europe. These subsidies, of course, cost money. So in this era of budget austerity, is renewable energy sustainable?
Well, first, I take issue that renewables are the only subsidized form of energy. A recent review of energy subsidy programs, whether through royalty relief, government spending programs, or the tax code, from 2002 through 2009, shows that the fossil fuel industries, coal, natural gas, and oil, received over $70 billion in subsidies courtesy of the American taxpayer, whereas renewables, geothermal, wind, solar, received $15 billion. So the fact is that if you want to look at subsidies, and that doesn't even include the indirect subsidies, like I had mentioned earlier, how much of our defense spending is spent patrolling sea lanes and defending our access to Middle Eastern oil. The fact is that when you do look at the renewable production tax credit and then the grant program complement to that was part of the stimulus bill, they all have expiration dates. Every single one of the major incentives for renewable energy has an expiration date. That is not true for oil and gas subsidies. Those are all permanent, including some of the recently enacted ones like the manufacturing deduction, which was put into law in 2004. So the lesson here is that if you want to promote renewable energy, your incentives are smaller and temporary. And if you want to provide incentives for oil and gas, which are mature technologies, they are larger and permanent. So I don't think that the subsidies for solar are unfair. I think that they are inadequate. Because when you look at the costs of our continued fossil fuel reliance, even though natural gas is cleaner burning than petroleum, than coal, the new extraction methods, and again, with all due respect to the folks in the room that are in the industry, it is not sustainable. The volumes of water that we are using is frightening. And we need to have a serious national debate, and there is a reason why. There is a groundswell of legitimate grassroots opposition that is building to this, to hydraulic fracturing. People are scared, and they should be, because when you start messing around with water resources, that is the most precious natural resource we have. And for those folks in the room that have children, that have grandchildren, we need to leave this continent and this world in a better place than we came into it. And the fact is that is threatened by a very expensive, inefficient, and non-sustainable path. So I think that we have to ramp up these subsidies for clean technology and shift away from the current levels of subsidies for fossil fuels.
Robert, 2 minutes.
Well, to be clear, I favor eliminating all energy subsidies across the board. Eliminate them now. Fair field, no favor. Let everybody compete head to head. See who wins. But with regard to these subsidies for the feed-in tariffs, and I don't know, Tyson, where you think the feed-in tariffs, where the money comes from in Gainesville or in Germany, it comes from other ratepayers. So the people that put these solar panels on their roof subsidize their neighbor. I'm guilty of the same. I live in Austin. I have 3,200 watts of solar panels. The city of Austin paid 2/3 of the cost. I write about the energy business. I wanted to learn the economics myself. So I invested in it. But the problem here is, as Margaret Thatcher had it right, socialism works great until you run out of other people's money. Fairfield, no favor. Eliminate all energy subsidies. This is gaining traction. Amory Lovins, Carl Pope at the Sierra Club, Jerry Taylor of the Cato Institute had a good piece in Forbes on this just the other day. But let me talk about my pet peeve, the corn ethanol swindle. The corn ethanol scam is now getting $16.2 billion per year in tax subsidies from the U.S. government. This is outrageous. The U.S. is now burning 40% of its corn. That's 15% of global corn. It's 5% of all global grain in order to produce the energy equivalent of 0.6% of global oil needs. The corn ethanol scammers have a tariff, a subsidy, and a mandate. And yet the president is completely silent on this. I voted for Obama. I wish him well, but this is just absolutely outrageous. And yet he continues to say, oh, we need to subsidize biofuels more because biofuels are the answer. It's fundamentally, absolutely, incredibly wrong. And I find it morally indefensible, the entire business. Wind subsidies are now 2.2 cents, just the production tax credit, 2.2 cents per kilowatt hour, amounts to an effective subsidy of $6.44 per million BTUs. The subsidy for wind is 150% of the market price of natural gas. I could go on. Solar, $7 per million BTU. GE got a $1.1 billion loan guarantee last year, or for their big wind project in Oregon, and a $500 million cash grant. GE, I don't think they need federal subsidies.
Okay. Would like to?
Yes, please.
Tyson's last X.
My last one. I better make it good.
I got one. I got one.
Let's talk about subsidies. Let's talk about what the subsidies are for new nuclear power generation. A new plant costs now $10 billion. Those costs are escalating. By the way, if you look at any graph of solar costs or wind costs, they're plummeting at the same time that new nuclear and new coal are increasing. Carbon capture and storage for clean coal, we don't even know what the costs are involved in that. The fact is that these new large baseload generation investments all need to be heavily taxpayer subsidized at rates that make solar and wind look like the bargain that they are. And on one other issue that I just wanted to address, since 2005, the largest 5 vertically integrated oil companies operating in America, BP, Exxon, and the others, have spent $452 billion on stock repurchase programs and on dividend payments to their shareholders. Imagine if we had spent $500 billion on solar deployment, on R&D, on electrification of the transportation sector. We would have a lot of Americans that wouldn't care about $4 a gallon gas right now.
Thank you. Oh, there we go.
Okay,
1 minute.
Thank you. So the oil industry is making too much money. The big 5 oil companies are making too much money. Do you know what the profit margin in the first quarter for the oil and the big integrated oil companies in the U.S. was? The profit margin? 6.5%. So Yahoo Finance numbers, not mine. That profit margin placed big oil's profitability at 114 out of 215 sectors looked at by Yahoo Finance. Those aren't my numbers. Why aren't you complaining about the railroads? Their profit margin in the first quarter was 15%. Why not go after the drug makers? Their profit margin was 16%. Big Oil's average return on equity in the first quarter, 15%. Weren't you complaining about auto parts stores, 40% return on equity? Major airlines, 39% return on equity. You're a consumer advocate. I don't understand. There's this idea, and you continually say it. I've looked up some of the statements you made, the fleecing of America by Big Oil, highway robbery by Big Oil. Their profit margins are hardly out of line with the rest of industry. And you somehow think that them making profit is a bad idea. If they don't make any profit, they don't drill more, and the price of oil goes higher.
All right. Well, now that we're done with our X's, you guys are going to have to, just
I
bite
could
your
use
tongue.
some more of those. Can I borrow another?
Well, now we've sort of transitioned to oil and gas, so let's go through a number of topics. And we sort of touched on this one, but Robert, I want to have you try, or maybe not try, to make an argument for maintaining the oil and gas tax subsidies. There's been a lot of talk recently about the oil and gas tax subsidies. Bills have been introduced by the Democrats in the Senate. Speaker Boehner maybe went off the reservation. We're not sure what happened, but he made some comments about maybe repealing these oil and gas tax subsidies here in the U.S. Can you make an argument for maintaining them in this era of really very solid profits and staggering deficits?
Well, again, I'll reiterate, I'm in favor of eliminating all energy subsidies. All energy subsidies, let everything compete, fair field, no favor. If that were to happen, solar and wind go out of business. Not today, they go out of business yesterday. You guys are a lot of tax people in the room. You understand that without the tax preferences given to solar and wind, solar and wind are essentially non-competitive. But this brouhaha lately over tax preferences, particularly for the oil and gas industry, is not about numbers, it's about demagoguery. The intangible drilling cost deduction has been in the tax code since 1913. Percentage depletion in the tax code since 1926. Fine, let's eliminate them. I can make a defense for both of those, I'll move on. Let's eliminate the tax credit for electric vehicles, $7,500, part of which is coming out of my pocket for buyers of the Chevy Volt and the Nissan Leaf. Maybe we're fortunate because neither of those cars are selling very well. In February, they sold 281 Volts and 67 copies of the Leaf. So much for the electric vehicle market. Total subsidies to the oil and gas industry this year, $4.4 billion. It's 1/10 of 1% of Obama's projected budget of $3.73 trillion. Obama has been all over this issue, and his position is completely incoherent. In 2005, when he was in the Senate, he voted for a bill that extended the subsidies and tax breaks for the tax preferences for the oil and gas sector. In his State of the Union in January, he said he wants to eliminate these preferences for what he called yesterday's energy and divert it to green energy. In his big speech in Georgetown in March, the president reversed his policy and said that we need more incentives for accelerated drilling. He said we need to provide new and better incentives that promote rapid, responsible development of oil and gas. And he wants to change the royalty structure to encourage more rapid production. That's a quote from the president. Then last month, again, he says, no, we need to stop subsidizing yesterday's energy. And he said, maybe he got it from Tyson, the oil industry is making record profits, and you're paying near record prices at the pump. It has to stop. Exactly a month ago today, April 26th, the president sent a letter to Congress, again asking to eliminate the $4.4 billion in tax preferences. The bogeyman of foreign oil appears 3 times in the 2-page letter, but just a few paragraphs below where he says we need to eliminate the tax preferences for oil and gas, he says when he says this approach will have an energy policy that creates jobs and makes our country more secure. But just a few paragraphs down, after he says, let's eliminate these tax preferences for oil and gas, he says that the U.S. should be investing in everything from wind and solar to biofuels and natural gas. Oh, so we're going to eliminate the tax preferences, but we're going to invest more in natural gas. Again, my head hurts. Which is it? It's inconsistent, it's incoherent. Look, let's eliminate all the tax preferences right now, Fairfield, no favor, and go forward. But to increase subsidies and tax preferences for uneconomic energy sources like wind and solar that have never become economic despite decades of subsidy, it's good money after bad.
2 minutes.
The issue is mature technologies versus emerging ones. And there is great merit to have government initiate those investments that the experts in our fields have identified as promising emerging technologies that deserve a foothold in the marketplace. I cannot find any credible source who believes that mature technologies that are proven profit centers should continue to receive taxpayer support. It's indefensible. And it is particularly indefensible at a time when working Americans are being asked to belt-tighten. When Congress makes a decision to cut Pell Grants, which provide cash assistance to smart, poor kids to attend college, and I go and debate the American Petroleum Institute on the NewsHour on PBS, and they say, absolutely, we deserve every tax break that we get, and they should all be off the table. That's indefensible. That is an indefensible position for the industry to take, and they need to understand that if average Americans are being asked to tighten their belts, that they need to as well. The fact that Robert somehow went through some numbers and made it seem like oil is a charity case, there's a lot of folks in the oil and gas industry here in the room today. And I think everybody knows that business is pretty darn good when the underlying commodity price for crude oil is $100 a barrel. That is a minting operation that is making excellent cash. And in fact, they have so much cash flow that they don't even know how to spend it all. And they're prioritizing repurchase programs and dividend payments, which is awesome if you're a shareholder. But we are missing huge opportunities to capture those revenues and invest them in the technologies that we need to end our addiction to oil. The fact is that the future has to be in decentralizing the grid and investing in renewables, because that is going to be the long-term fuel choice that is going to make our economy energy independent.
Thank you. Okay, next question for you, Tyson, for 3 minutes. President Obama continues to, tentatively anyway, support some increased domestic production of oil and gas. So recently it includes a call for lease sales in Alaska's National Petroleum Reserve and an acceleration of seismic work off the mid-Atlantic and southern coasts. Is this position incongruous with an administration often referred to as the greenest presidency ever? And does it come as a disappointment to environmental groups?
Right, good question. It's deja vu for me, because on March 31st of 2010, I wrote on my blog, Obama's Drill to Nowhere, and it was in response to his huge speech at an Air Force base in Maryland in 2010, where he announced a very similar expansion of offshore drilling, and in fact, an expansion of drilling off of Virginia, in addition to Gulf of Mexico and Alaska. 2 weeks later, BP Deepwater Horizon occurred, and that proposal was pulled off the table. And I wrote at the time, and you can go back and read my blog, I said this had everything to do with the Republican radio ads, attack ads, that had just been unveiled the week before, in March of 2010, that were accusing of Barack Obama's radical environmental policies were resulting in gasoline prices raising $1 a gallon. So Obama's a politician, okay? So his approach right now, he's running for re-election against what looks to be a fairly weak Republican field, unfortunately. But this is all about what he feels is to counter Republican attacks about raising gasoline prices and his ability to position and define the election on his terms. I mean, the fact is that we've already examined what the role of increasing offshore drilling will have on prices and imports, right? Under the Bush administration, the Energy Information Administration in 2007 did a whole survey, right? You can go on their website, it's still up there, and it's exhaustive. They say, okay, let's assume that we open up all the areas that are currently off limits, offshore, West Coast, Gulf of Mexico, East Coast. Let's open it all up. What's the impact? Insignificant on prices, insignificant on reducing imports. Look, the United States in 2011 is the third largest crude oil producing nation in the world. Only the Saudis and the Russians produce more than we do. We do not have a production problem. We have a consumption problem. We use 1 out of every 4 barrels of oil every day. We use 20 million barrels of it, and we use it incredibly inefficiently. The fact is that we've got to make the kinds of investments in our transportation sector to become a heck of a lot smarter. Motor vehicle registrations are down 11% in my home district of Washington, D.C. You're seeing more and more people in the suburbs do these crazy rideshare programs where they're hanging out like day laborers on the side of the road getting picked up by commuters because people are scrambling to find innovative solutions to high gasoline prices because we lack the investments to give them the tools they need to comprehensively address it. When you've got a transportation budget of $170 billion, that's how much federal and state and local governments are going to spend on transportation infrastructure. All the incentives are for highway construction, not for mass transit investments. We've got to do better.
Thank you. Robert, 2 minutes.
Well, let me just read back a couple of the phrases. Excellent cash, addiction to oil, energy independent. My last book, or my third book, Gusher of Lies, The Dangerous Delusions of Energy Independence. I'm stunned that this phrase is even still used. The U.S. is the world's largest energy producer, largest energy consumer. Why would it ever try to be independent of the world's single biggest market, the global oil and gas market, is beyond me. Addiction to oil. I'm not addicted to oil. I don't waste any. I always use just exactly the right amount. And the idea that, you know, oh, well, we need to become radically more efficient. Well, okay, fine, but there's a cost to increasing efficiency. And if you're making minimum wage, you can't afford a Prius. You're going to be lucky to afford a used Olds 88 or something else. Domestic oil and gas production. Drill here, drill now. Drill in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. I've been for that for years. We need to keep the Trans-Alaska Pipeline flowing and operating. And if that pipeline had never been built, the U.S. would be producing about 1 million barrels, well, not now, 500,000 barrels a day now, less than it would. The Green Left was adamantly opposed to the Alaska Pipeline. Yesterday, the EIA released a report. It said the title was U.S. Oil Import Dependence, Declining No Matter How You Measure It. Why is it declining? Well, those nasty guys in the oil and gas business just keep innovating, and they keep getting more oil out of the ground from areas that were thought to be devoid of any future resources. The shale oil revolution now will mean over the next 5 years, U.S. oil production will likely increase by 1 million barrels a day. The shale gas revolution is just starting. The shale oil revolution is just starting. We're in the second inning. And to continue the baseball analogy, the U.S. is playing a home game. We invented the rules, we invented the equipment, and we have a 10-run lead over the rest of the world. What this is going to mean for petrochemicals, for refining, for the steel industry, if you have a question, I'm happy to answer it. The U.S. steel industry, Nucor, U.S. Steel, Steel Dynamics, all building or planning to build new steel plants because of cheap natural gas. This is incredibly good news for the U.S. manufacturing sector. And no, we're not going to be energy independent or, well, go on. Or I'll stop.
Thank you. All right, well, you actually gave me a great segue on our next question, and it relates to shale gas.
Sure.
So you may have, I assume many of you in the room are aware of the recent study that was released by Professor Robert Howarth of Cornell University. He published a report on the environmental impacts of shale gas. His study. The report concludes that shale gas results in 30% greater greenhouse gas emissions than conventional well gas and 20% more than coal. Surprising findings. Do these findings mean that we need to slow down the shale gas boom and proceed with more caution on shale gas production and hydraulic fracturing?
Well, look, there are a lot of issues. The Howarth study has been debunked by many credible places. One of the assumptions in the report is that the gas industry simply vents up to 8% of their production. Name me one industry that will simply let 8% of their product evaporate or escape into the atmosphere and still be profitable. I mean, it beggars belief. But yet this study has gotten all kinds of traction. Howarth has made it clear he's opposed to the natural gas industry. So I don't find it a credible study at all. All of that said, hydraulic fracturing, this is an issue the industry has to deal with. And I'm not going to dismiss it out of hand and say, oh, everything's perfectly safe, it's perfectly fine. I started my career in publishing in national publications more than 20 years ago. writing stories about oil field pollution. I've seen bad actors, and a lot of them. I understand how bad the situation can be. I've talked to people with contaminated wells. But I think what we're seeing now is the backlash against the oil and gas industry, which routinely comes out as the least favored industry behind even the federal government in public opinion polls. You add that dim view of the industry with people who raise a lot of money by demonizing the industry, by promoting their agenda, and it's an easy way to just demonize the industry and say, well, we need to do something else. But fracking, I think, is largely a scapegoat, and it's an easy one. Oh, fracking, well, that sounds kind of like another word, and so it gets, picked up a lot. But I think what's happening is this backlash against the industry because, and it was mentioned yesterday in the shale gas session, was that a lot of this drilling is happening in people's backyards, and they don't like it. And I wouldn't either. If I had trucks rolling through my, the road next to my bedroom 24 hours a day for weeks at a time, I'd hate it. And that's the challenge, I think, for the industry is dealing with the intensity and and this is a resource play. It's high-intensity drilling. You're going to have to reduce the size of your pads. You're going to have to drill more wells from smaller footprints. You're going to have to do everything you can to reduce water and consumption. And I think what's interesting, what Probert talked about yesterday, using a frac fluid that's food safe. I mean, yeah. Then what are the opponents going to say? Oh no, well you put Jell-O in my well. Well, it's easy for them to say, well, you're using diesel fuel, or you're using, benzene, xylene, whatever. Oh, well, now you're putting guar gum. Oh, I hate guar gum. Well, in any case, but if you look at what's happening now, I think the industry is starting to understand that, but it's going to be a long process. Rex Tillerson of ExxonMobil had their annual meeting yesterday, said they're going to start an advertising campaign focused on educating the public about fracturing so that the public gets the facts instead of a lot of hyperbole about, this is a threat to everyone's drinking water everywhere. Well, it's good for fundraising for certain groups, but the reality is completely being obscured by a lot of this disinformation.
2 minutes, Tyson.
There are tens of thousands of hardworking, honest people of integrity in the oil and gas industry. But there is no question that the industry has a significant credibility problem on certain issues. And for Robert to sit here and say that, well, Exxon is going to fund a multi-million-dollar ad campaign to set the record straight on fracking, I am alarmed at that. When a vested interest is going to use its new Citizens United empowered opportunities to tell us, the American people, about an industry that it has billions of dollars invested in. I'm sorry, I don't trust ExxonMobil to tell me the truth about what fracking does to water. We need to have independent experts analyze this, and I don't like it when special interests go into legislation like they did in 2005 and get two little paragraphs inserted into legislation that exempt just them from regulation. I think the American people like fairness, and I like industries to be treated fairly. I don't like it when lobbyists insert their special interest privileges into legislation and get off scot-free. The fact is, states are overwhelmed and inadequately prepared to regulate this industry. We have to have federal regulation. I'm not seeking to punish the oil industry, but I don't like it when companies get little special exemptions from law that other industries have to comply with. The fact is that there are risks involved. Rex Tillerson said yesterday at the shareholder meeting, he said, I have to be honest, fracking involves risks. And then he said, we're going to try and mitigate those, and we're going to try and communicate to the American people. But the fact is that we are really putting our water systems and our communities at risk here, and we need to slow this process down before a really major catastrophe happens with fracking.
Thank you. Our last question, and then we'll have an opportunity for some involvement from the audience. Tyson, this is for you. There has been much talk in recent years of a worldwide nuclear renaissance. Have the tragic events in Japan ended that renaissance and plunged us back into a nuclear dark age? 3 minutes.
The nuclear renaissance is entirely dependent upon huge levels of subsidy. Now, I've talked about subsidies that go to renewable energy. But the loan guarantee program, the federal loan guarantee program, is essential for the nuclear power industry. Dick Cheney famously said back in 2001 that without the Price-Anderson Act, where taxpayers provide catastrophic risk insurance for commercial nuclear operators, Dick Cheney said without Price-Anderson, there would be no commercial nuclear power industry in the United States. Imagine you trying to get insurance for your 16-year-old driver in your household. It's very expensive, and let's say the taxpayer picked it up because you had a lobbyist that was able to secure that. The industry has been extremely effective at procuring subsidies for itself. Alex Flint, who's the head of government relations for the Nuclear Energy Institute, he spoke to my class recently. I teach an honors seminar at the University of Maryland, College Park. Maybe some of you in the room will now try to get me removed as a faculty member. I don't know. But he came and spoke, and he was very frank with my students. He came 2 weeks after the Fukushima incident, and he acknowledged some of the facts that I had talked about demand destruction in the United States, the rise of energy efficiency, the fact that we're really looking at structural electricity growth of 0.6% a year. And he said, very bluntly, he said, we see the opportunities for nuclear power outside the United States. He did not cite the regulatory challenges. He didn't cite the financial challenges. It was purely a situation where the electricity growth in the United States was not great enough for his members to invest the kinds of massive amounts of capital and construction lead times that's required to build these massive new nuclear power facilities. So in the United States, I think we've got the one being built by Southern Company down in Georgia. I think that's going to get built. I think that if you're going to look at nuclear power, building these massive light water reactors that cost $10 billion or more a pop is just unfeasible. It takes too long to build them, and there are too many opportunities wasted in terms of alternative investments. I think looking at modular reactors would make a lot more sense. Their price tag is around $700 million for one that's about 140 megawatts versus $10 billion for 1,200 megawatts. So I think that Fukushima has definitely taught us some lessons. I'm still sorry that Congress hasn't mandated the kind of disaster response strategies for communities around nuclear power plants that we have for Department of Homeland bioterrorism training, because I think that one of the lessons of Fukushima is that we need to make sure our communities are well prepared for an accident or a terrorist attack on these facilities.
Robert, two minutes.
Well, I'm adamantly pro-nuclear, adamantly pro-natural gas. End-to-end, natural gas to nuclear. It's one of the thesis points in my book. The world is moving toward natural gas, moving toward nuclear for a lot of reasons. We want the cleanest, densest, cheapest possible fuels, and the world is decarbonizing, urbanizing, electrifying. Those three megatrends, decarbonization, urbanization, electrification, are extremely bullish for natural gas and extremely bullish for nuclear. Fully aware of what happened at Fukushima, huge disaster. Tokyo Electric still doesn't have the reactors under control. It will be months before they do. But even in the wake of Fukushima, recognizing all the problems at Fukushima, my stance on nuclear is the same. If you're anti-nuclear and anti-carbon dioxide, you're pro-blackout. You just love darkness. Well, I'm anti-darkness. Why nuclear? Because of power density. Nuclear is the way to go because the power densities available in nuclear are available nowhere else. The power densities inside a light water reactor are on the order of hundreds of megawatts per square meter. Compare that with wind turbines, 1 watt per square meter. Solar, depending on how you value it, 5, maybe 20 watts per square meter. The Transocean Deepwater Horizon was mentioned. Power density on that vessel, had they been producing the 50,000 barrels of oil that ended up in the Gulf, 127,000 watts per square meter. Power density is what we're after. That's why nuclear is going to be a key part of the future. Maybe not here in the U.S. Nuclear was effectively at a standstill in the U.S. long before Fukushima because of low-cost natural gas. Last fall, Exelon said they need nat gas at $8 for nuclear to be economically competitive. So I understand that, but for public citizen to be anti-nuclear, again, I don't understand it. Fission now provides about 20% of U.S. electricity. It avoids the emissions of about 650 million tons of CO2 in the U.S., 12% of U.S. CO2. It's the only zero carbon source that we can look to for large-scale electric production going forward. Several companies are developing modular reactors, Babcock and Wilcox. Thorium is very promising, but nuclear is clearly going to be part of the solution, but just not in the U.S. in the near term.
Excellent. Thank you both. That concludes our planned questions. Now there's an opportunity to take a few from the audience. I want to take a couple, and we've also got some response questions where, your devices. So if you want to walk to a microphone if you've got a question, we'll have time for a few, or if we've got a couple written. Thank you.
Or folks can just charge up here to the stage.
That's right. Okay, nobody wants to stand up and rebut
Really?
one of our speakers. Okay.
Come on.
Oh, do we have one?
No question.
Oh, yeah. Okay, who's going back to yes, microphone 2. Angela, please.
I'd like to ask Tyson what the source of your information is on the size of the subsidies to the renewable energy industry. It seems awfully low to me, being in that industry myself.
Right. It was a report by WRI, World Resources Institute, and my email address is tslocum@citizen.org, and I will mail you a copy of that report. So they were looking at subsidies from 2002 through 2009. And the I'm sorry? In
the last 2 years, it's been $7 billion just in grants alone.
Right. There's no question that through the stimulus bill that there have been significant additions, again, that are temporary in nature through the grant program and the production tax credit that have been extremely big in terms of deploying particularly wind projects in the United States. I mean, in Oregon, just last week, you had a situation where there was so much wind energy being generated so efficiently that BPA, Bonneville Power Administration, had to reject a bulk of that generation because it was overwhelming the grid. And so wind power is so efficient in parts of the United States that the grid cannot handle it. And so there is huge opportunities here, and there's no question that we've seen increases in renewable energy incentives and subsidies in the last couple of years, but that doesn't change the underlying dynamic that fossil fuel industries receive far more any way you look at it.
Thank you. Okay, we've got another question back at number 2, then we'll take one at number 3, and then we'll move on to our computer questions. Please go ahead.
My question's also directed for you, Tyson. When you spoke on all the oil and gas companies making significant profits, that they don't need any sort of additional incentives, and also that it's a mature technology and we need to shift to renewables, I would like to hear your response to the fact that not all companies within the energy, especially the oil and gas industry, are experiencing significant profits, especially in light of the moratoria in the Gulf. That a lot of those companies, especially the independents, have been under significant financial stress, and also in order to advance technology within the hydrocarbon sector, you spoke to water use and fracking. Well, to advance that technology, you need additional funding. Where do you think that's going to come from if companies are not allowed to earn profits?
First, I don't recall ever saying that companies should not be allowed to earn profits. I'm saying
not very much.
No.
Just an amount that you mandate or you think or public citizen says is okay.
I think the question was to me.
Okay, sorry. I can't help myself.
I am not against profits. That is what drives innovation. I am a capitalist. However, I do not appreciate when an industry gets special tax breaks at a time when the rest of America is being asked to forego essential government services. There is no question that there has been an impact on the industry because of low natural gas prices and because of the moratorium. If people are seeking someone to blame for the moratorium, I suggest that you not look at the Obama administration, but that you look at BP, because the industry had an opportunity to take care of their own business, and they messed up. They messed up in a big way, and any president would have done what Obama did to put that moratorium, because in the congressional testimony from that summer, none of the majors had any sort of subsea containment policy because they weren't required to. I don't like government having to come in and babysit large corporations. But when large corporations fail the public trust the way they did in the Gulf of Mexico, you have to, as a nation, step in and start looking over their shoulder and babying them. And I hate to admit that, but it's a fact. If the industry had simply invested those profits into subsea containment systems, into a prioritization of their workers' safety, remember 11 Americans lost their lives, okay? It was a failure of epic proportions. And I understand that low natural gas prices are creating some hardship for independents. So again, I'm not trying to demonize profit here, but when I see oil companies, particularly the vertically integrated ones, spend almost $500 billion since 2005 buying back stock and paying dividends, that is a massive misallocation of capital. The United States has huge energy challenges, and that money is not being reinvested into things that are going to liberate us from high oil prices. And so I would like to see the oil and gas industry provide more of a leadership role. They failed us in the Gulf, and I want to give them an opportunity to start leading again. And until they do, we're going to require tough regulations to make sure that American workers are protected, that fishermen and folks that own commercial properties on the Gulf
John, I hate to interrupt this sermon,
but
can I interrupt here? Because big oil,
Please.
they're buying back stock. Let me see. Big oil, the shares 1% are owned by insiders, 37% of the shares are owned by individual investors, and the remaining 62% are owned by institutional investors like mutual funds and pension funds. You say you're against profit, you say you're for capitalism, and yet I hear you say, oh no, they're using their money the wrong way. I don't get that. I fundamentally don't understand. You're saying that the investors in these companies don't deserve a return on their investment. They don't deserve the dividend. The people who have invested in their mutual funds shouldn't expect any price appreciation in the shares that they bought. Sorry to interrupt the sermon, but
No.
I had to.
I should have known that opening this up was going to open up another can of worms. So let's do this. Last question from the audience. We'll get a 30-second response. All we'll do, and then we're going to move to our question. So microphone number 3, please.
I have 2 questions. One is really related to this topic, and I welcome the answer from any of the gentlemen on the stage. What is the net tax amount paid by oil and gas and the oil and gas industry after the subsidy? Because that's one thing that is never really spoken to. The amount, especially by the integrated, that's paid by far outnumbers the collective tax of individuals in this country that's paid. So I think there's really a misleading categorization of subsidy, because I don't know that even these companies that are receiving for renewable energy a tax subsidy are even subject to a tax expense net of that, whereas the other companies that are surely making profits have huge tax bill even after that net subsidy. And then the second question relates to the grid, and I certainly understand and recognize the need for other technologies as we go forward, but will we realistically ever be able to rely on whether it be wind or solar, given the nature of weather and what it's relied upon? We don't have strong windy days, 100 days or 365 days of the year in all locations. We don't have rain every day. We don't have sun or cities where there is constant sunlight. So how do you envision ever being able to rely on those technologies to ever make up maybe beyond 8% of your total energy needs?
Hey, Robert, take those 2 questions. Give us 30 seconds on this.
Sure. Well, I don't know the answer specifically how much the industry pays in taxes, but I can tell you that every year the U.S. upstream sector, just using rough numbers, approximately $3 million a well. I know the gentleman at Pioneer yesterday said they're spending $8 million a well in the Eagle Ford. But the upstream sector in the U.S. alone spends $250 billion a year. That's $250 billion a year. I know that's not enough for Tyson, but okay. $21 billion a year are paid in royalties to mineral owners in this country. It is one of the great unrecognized elements of American prosperity. Private ownership of mineral rights is anomalous. The U.S. is one of the only countries in the world that has anything like it, and it is one of the key reasons for the rise of the middle class in this country, completely unrecognized. Finally, I can answer the question on ExxonMobil. They paid $1.6 billion in income taxes last year. Yeah, they're profitable and they paid taxes. General Electric gets a big subsidy, didn't pay any. I'm sorry, I know they're a KPMG client.
All public information.
You guys are doing well for them.
Okay, well, let's stop there. We've got, we had a fair...
1 minute? 30 seconds.
30 seconds.
30 seconds.
On the taxes, I asked last week that the 5 majors release their corporate income tax statements that they file with the IRS, because I would like to see how much they pay, and they haven't yet responded to our request. So that could settle the debate once and for all about their corporate income tax liability. Second, the issue on the grid. The United States since 1950 has seen an 87% increase in population density. I'm going to have to tell you, I'm a huge fan of the U.S. Constitution, particularly the Fourth Amendment, and we are not going to make the huge centralized grid investments in this country, because we've got people living where there used to be tumbleweeds when we built the interstate highway system. And the fact is, the United States has an infrastructure system that was designed to accommodate cheap access to fossil fuels. Those days are over. We have to reorganize our transportation electric grid, or else we are not going to survive in the 21st century, period.
Thank you. Okay, so pick up your devices. A couple quick questions for you. We're going to register those up here, and then we're going to move on to a very quick break and on to our breakout. So, question number 1. Today's debate has A, reinforced my existing views on energy policy, B, has introduced a new layer of complexity to the arguments that I had not really appreciated before, or C, has changed my mind on one or more items of energy policy. Please take a minute to answer that, or 10 seconds. Okay. So for 53% of you, you were right before, and you're even righter now in your mind. Got it. But 44% of you think that maybe this is a little more complex than you thought. We haven't changed a lot of minds today. Okay, let's go on to the next question. I believe that energy policy will be a critical factor in the 2012 presidential race. Yes, it will be. No, it will not be. Okay. So 64% of you think it will be a critical factor in the presidential race this year or next year. Okay, good. Let's go on to the next one. I believe energy policy will be a critical factor in 2012 House and Senate races, energy being a local issue. So do we think it'll be important in the House and Senate races? Go ahead, take 10 seconds. The answer is slightly less think it will be important in the local races, the House Senate races. Okay. Now, coming to the final 2 important questions. Whose position did you agree with more today? Robert Bryce or B, Tyson Slocum? It's really just going to be a question of margin, I think, on this one. Well, let's just see what we get. Okay, so please take 10 seconds to answer that one. Pat on the back. And? Okay, it's about what we expected. All right.
2%, I love you guys.
Yeah.
Closer than I thought.
All right, last question, the very last one. Now, put aside whose position you agree with. As a practical matter, as a matter of debating and rhetorical argument, who do you think won the debate, Robert or Tyson? So you lost 2% on that one, Tyson. So there you go. Excellent, excellent. Well, look, I want to thank our debaters. That was a remarkable exchange. I hope everybody had a lot of fun. So let's all give them a round of applause. Outstanding. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.